I'm very happy to present to you a dear colleague for the last lecture of the Ciclo Aula Mediterránea. And I would like to thank him for accepting our invitation to come. And I would also like to take the opportunity to thank the IEMed for the organization of this cycle of lectures and for hosting us tonight. Our esteemed speaker tonight is Dr. Mohammad Kalantari. He's lecturer in international relations and also the director of the Center for Islamic and West Asian Studies at Royal Holloway University of London. He is also a fellow for the project on sectarianism, desectarianization, and proxies. And Dr. Kalantari's interests span the politics and international relations of the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. And he has a particular focus on the interaction of regional doctrines, Muslim clerical elites, and their transnational networks. He has also published widely along his interests and has furthermore collaborated actively with policymakers and researchers in various interdisciplinary projects addressing the contemporary affairs of the Middle East and the Muslim world. Dr. Kalantari is also the author of the recently published book titled The Clergy and the Modern Middle East, Shi'i Activism in Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon. And I warmly recommend you read it and also to engage with Dr. Kalantari's work. So without further ado, I will hand over to Dr. Kalantari. His lecture will take approximately 45 minutes, which will be followed by a question and answer session. For this, please do not hesitate to place your questions into the Q&A box, which you can find in Zoom at the bottom of your screen. And please don't hesitate to do so already as they arise. And then once we start the Q&A session, we will go through them. So, and with this, I'll hand over to you, Mohammad. Welcome once more, and I'm looking forward to hearing.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Olivia. It's a pleasure. Good evening, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to being with you today, albeit virtually. And for this, I have to thank my good friend, Olivia, and the Institute for the invitation. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to share a presentation. That way I can control myself to not go beyond the time. So, can you see this?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
I'm just going to minimize this as well. So great. I chose this title, Iran's Strategic Deepening the Fertile Crescent, to talk about the country's policies since the 1979 revolution and why Fertile Crescent. I mean, first of all, I think I didn't have enough time to come up with a better or more appropriate, but after a while I found it quite an appropriate term as well, to talk about a region which encompasses part of Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, among some other countries in the Middle East. So I use this term to kind of bundle up the main geography of my talk. The term, especially its first part, however, has some irony in it. It's a sad truth of our day to see the region that once was so fertile to be considered as the birthplace of agriculture and life, a cradle of civilization, as they call it, culture and human knowledge, has been entangled in incessant conflicts and miseries in the last 7 decades. So that was a bit of disclaimer to start with. Today, I divided my talk in 3 sections. I start with a little bit of history, Take into account its history, I would argue it's essential to decipher today's Iran, its regional policies, and its standing in the world. So I would start by the 1979 revolution to discuss why did the revolution happen. Here I also go into the construct of Iranian identity to frame the relationship of Iranians with a revolutionary ideology, revolutionary Shi'ism, which is infused with an anti-oppression sentiment. This is the thesis of my argument today, which has shaped and is going to shape Iran's strategic depth, I argue, no matter who is in charge in the country. I then, in the second part, delve more into the role of Shi'i ideology, shaping Iran's foreign policy throughout the region. And finally, I put Iran and its foreign policy into a more global perspective, aiming to kind of evaluate its strategic depth.
Wonderful.
So,
without interrupting you, may I ask you, could you switch on the camera? I think the audience cannot see you. Thank you.
Okay, so can you see my presentation?
I can see you and your presentation now, and I think the audience also can see you. Thank you.
Okay, great. Sorry about this. So why did the revolution happen? Many has asked and answered this question to the extent to which it has become a cliche. Nonetheless, 1979 revolution is a significant case of how the Western policymakers misperceive an incident with such a magnitude in the Middle East. Why the revolution happened in the way and with the speed it happened, nobody really knows. From the moment of its occurrence, the Iranian revolution has posed a problem for social scientists like us interested in explaining it. The massive social mobilization it entailed and the impact it has had in reconfiguring, so to speak, power relations in the region and beyond clearly make the Iranian revolution an extraordinary world historical event begging to be understood and explained. However, its unexpectedness, intensity, and use of religion as revolutionary ideology have made difficult efforts to come to terms with its nature and evolution. Not that many have not tried. In fact, despite the fact that the close history of the Iranian revolution is yet to be written, there is relative abundance of literature or explanatory theories about why and how it happened. In general terms, revolutionary moment, after all, is characterized by confusion, by fluidity, instability, and unpredictability. Generally, how people will act in a situation of confusion is still a mystery, and political transformation orchestrated by popular social movements cannot be predicted. Observers, however, argue revolutions in general, and here I'm trying to use that general arguments, applying them to the Iranian revolution from using couple of explanation: economic, political, military, and cultural. The economic explanation, to start with, refers to the fact that revolution take place or occur when the economic problems worsen, especially after a period of relative prosperity. So this could be quite close to our attention these days across the Middle East and perhaps beyond. So proponents of this theory, when they applied that to Iran's 1979 revolution, explained that how the oil boom of 1970s gave way to a recession in 1977 and ultimately resulted in the revolution. Another common explanation for revolutions in general is obviously a political one. The political explanation of a revolution argues that revolution happens when a regime relaxes its pressure and efforts and basically tries and offers opportunities for mass mobilization for a period. In the case of Iran, again, those observers argue that it was basically in the aftermath of US President Jimmy Carter, when his administration pressured Shah of Iran to relax the regime repression. This relaxation ultimately led to the revolution. The third explanation here is the military explanation. And I'm explaining these different categories or explanatory kind of items, because later on I want to come back to them, trying to lay down what's going on today. So when it comes to military explanation, social scientists and scholars of revolutions argue that they occur when a regime basically loses its capacity to break down protesters on the street. And then they come up with evidences from 1978-79 to mention how that was the explanation for the topple down of Shah and his regime. And finally, many have tried to explain revolution in terms of cultural and ideological aspects. They believe that revolutions happen or take place when a movement can draw upon oppositional norms, ideologies, beliefs, cultures, rituals in a society. So when it comes to our case in Iran of 1979, they obviously say that the Iranian revolutionary movement succeeded in drawing up Shi'i Islamic practices. This is basically my general field of expertise. It seems, however, that none of these viewpoints could single-handedly explain why the revolution happened in Iran in 1979. 40 years on, the subject, as I said, is still stirring debates, even among the remnants of revolutionary Iranians themselves. At any rate, as we all know, the Islamic Republic succeeded the monarchical regime in Iran in early 1979. Since then, thousands of observers and investigators, IR scholars, have penned about how good or evil the new government is, how it is totalitarian, anti-West or undemocratic, and so on and so forth. Why Iranians in masses took active part in the revolution against the Shah, however, has a very well-known story to it, which I'd like to clear it right at the beginning. A story which is not exclusive to Iranians, as you know, but is relevant to almost every other nations across the region and beyond. In simple words, throughout the global south, the quest for democracy and independence is the crux of that story. The story of freedom and liberation, the story of fighting against authoritarian rulers and the imperial powers. Although it is known as the Islamic Revolution, perhaps for the fact that clerics managed to seize the power in the aftermath of the topple down of the Shah, in reality, the 1979 revolution was the expression of a long repressed desire for popular sovereignty by ordinary Iranians. Then the popular religious elites, as we all know, led the revolutionaries and introduced the motto of independence, freedom, the Islamic Republic. Following the call of their charismatic leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, Iranians rushed into ballots, and in March 1979, 98% of voters voted for Iranian monarchy in a quiet, free election, the first and, in eyes of many, the only free election in Iran, in post-revolutionary Iran. And they voted for the new regime, the new system, the new government, which is called the new Islamic Republic of Iran. So what happened in these 43 years? The most fitting and revealing approach to understand the post-revolution Iran is to note the three constituting components of its identity, what I called the idea of Iran. Persian nationalism, Shi'ism, anti-oppression, let's say, vast sentiments. Rather than a totalitarian political order, a more persuasive argument about the Islamic Republic is that the state fosters a mix of Iranian nationalism, Shi'i political Islam, and anti-Western sentiments that forms a core ideology which resonates with particular social groups. This ideological mix either generates bases of support within active defenders of the state and representative institutions, or at least creates tacit acceptance of the state as legitimately acting in the majority of the population's interest. So since its establishment, time and again, the Islamic Republic and its leadership has been calibrating a mixture of these three components to boost the popular support and to implement its domestic as well as its regional and international policies abroad. And you could see that in all the discourses coming out of the leadership throughout these 40-odd years. So let's start with Iranian nationalism. I try to go quite fast here. Iran is the only country in the region which has not been colonized, at least in its general sense. For what it's worth, it's not a creation of the modern time. It's not an artificially created state. Two streams of Iranian nationalism still evident and present among indigenous Iranians are that referring to pre-Islamic Iran and that of the Islamic Iran or the post-Islamic Iran period. Two symbols of the former are obviously the Zoroaster, the philosopher prophet, the ancient philosopher prophet, and of course Cyrus the Great, who established the first Persian Empire about 3,000 years ago. But many also argue that when it comes to Iranian nationalism, one could not ignore the role of Islam, and that could be interesting. I mean, there could be interesting argument here which we can delve more into in our Q&A session. They discuss about the mutual services of Iran and Islam and how these two help each other, which arguably led to the sort of revitalization of a nationalized sense of Islam in shape of Shi'ism in Iran. A crucial element of this narrative served to identify Shi'i Islam as an integral and inseparable constituent of Iranian identity today. In some Iranian Shi'i myths, after Arab invasion, the Hussein, Imam Hussein of the third Imam of Shia, married the princess of Iran, who was captive, and therefore, based on those myths, all succeeding imams, Shi'i imams after Hussein, are also Iranian descent. So these further kind of intertwined Iranian nationalism and Shi'i Islam. And of course, as we know, for the last 500 years, Iran has been under Shi'i rule in one way or other, which makes it quite unique among other Muslim nations. Second, Shi'ism itself. I'm not going to talk about the imamate and occultation because these are two main discourses and doctrines and beliefs embedded in Shi'i Islam. The very fact that 12 infallible imams are basically has the authority, and then the last of them went to hiding, to occultation, and currently, based on 12 Shi'i belief, we are facing or living in the occultation era. And Shias believe that they are deprived of this infallible divine source of authority for the time being. So in that sense, they address this question: what should we do in this sort of interim period, and who should rule over us or among us? And addressing this dilemma, Shi'i clerical authority kind of came up with this refashioned and relabeled, in a sense, doctrine of the guardianship of the jurist, which again put into practice by Ayatollah Khomeini in the aftermath of the revolution. The core idea entails that in the absence of the infallible imam, somebody should take responsibility to govern, to legislate, to arbitrate among members of the community. And the guardianship of the jurist theory reserve those rights for qualified Muslim jurists and scholars among the Shias. And finally, the final component of the post-revolution identity is the anti-oppression sentiment, or pro-downtrodden, let's say, sentiment. To counter oppression in the region, the revolutionaries introduced this famous doctrine of export of revolution. The third article of the Islamic Republic Constitution states that the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran has the duty of directing all its resources to framing the foreign policy of the country on the basis of Islamic criteria, fraternal commitment to all Muslims, and unsparing support to the deprived of the world. So triggered by these components, by this identity, in the aftermath of the revolution, some mostly Islamic movements raised to fame throughout the region. Iran has become the spiritual and in some cases the financial sponsor of those movements. Just months after the revolution in November 1979, we had this seizure of Grand Mosque in Mecca, Saudi Arabia. Later on, we had Islamic Front for the Liberation of Bahrain, attempted coup in Bahrain. We had the assassination of President Anwar Sadat of Egypt, by members of Egyptian Islamic Jihad, and obviously the attacks on US and Western assets and interests in Kuwait and Lebanon, and finally this the foundation of Hezbollah there. But so it was quite a messy period in the modern history of Middle East. The question I'm trying to address here is what role the Shi'i ideology had in all this, and how Shias and its revolutionary doctrine are at play within the region since then. And it would be interesting to take a look at some numbers quite quickly. I use these numbers many times in many of my talks, and I think they are important to be considered. Different people might come up or might draw different conclusion from these numbers, but for the sake of our argument, was when we consider countries in the Middle East and their population, it appears that Shias constitute almost 35% of the whole population in the Middle East. More interesting when we bring or focus on the Persian Gulf area, the heart of the Middle East. That percentage raises to 62%. I mean, over 60%. Their role of Shias, or they importance become more preponderant when we take a look at this famous map, which shows that almost 80% of oil and natural gas deposits in the region are located in Shi'i inhabited areas. So looking at these numbers, looking at this map, one may assume that it is an easy task for a Shi'i state to mobilize its so-called co-religionist throughout the region, and comes out as the most predominant force or power in the Middle East, to become a regional power or regional hegemon. The reality on the ground is different and suggests otherwise. Since what I call the 2009 moment in Fertile Crescent in Iraq and Lebanon, and through ongoing uprising, which started with mobilizations around socioeconomic and governance issues in those countries, anti-Iranian sentiments in Iraq and Lebanon have been heightening. Take, for instance, the Iraqi protesters. I mean, the photo I choose on the left-hand side. They stormed at and set fire to the Iranian consulate in Najaf, the city of Najaf, not in Baghdad, not Erbil, but in Najaf in November 2019. The story is not that much different among Shias in Lebanon. I mean, less hostile, but still. And this indicates, although some of them are anecdotal, but indicates, for the sake of the argument, that not all Shias in the region are necessarily unreservedly pro-Iran. This again is not unprecedented. The Iran-Iraq war during 1980 up until 1988 displays a much more illuminating point about the transnational Shi'i ideology. So the war lasted 8 years, one of the longest war in the modern history, and more than 1 million were killed or injured on both sides. The war, interestingly, for the sake of our argument, our talk today, engaged almost 70% of all Shiites in the world who were killing each other, and followed drastic result for both countries. with the risk of self-promotion, I wrote about this incident from the media political communication point of view, and you could refer the detailed, or I mean, for the detailed argument, you could refer to that paper of mine. At the end of the war, it was clear to Iranian leadership that a policy solely drafted on the premises of Shi'i Islam or Shi'i transnational solidarity might not be working, and is not enough to safeguard their interest. The Shi'i factor in Iran's foreign policy also resulted in its ever-encompassing rivalry with another major state in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia. In times to counter its regional autonomy, Iran had no choice but to play the sectarian card. The so-called instrumentalization of sects or Shiism and sectarianized politics. We at CEPAD, where I and Olivia both are fellow of, we had this quite rich debate for the last couple of years to entangle this sectarian conflict between not only Iran and Saudi Arabia, but broader debate. So again, I ask you to refer to STEPAD and its activities at the website if you want to hear and know and listen more about this issue. I will get back to Saudi Arabia and its relation with Iran later on in my talk. So before that, let me lay out my general point here that is Iran policy in the contemporary era is much more about real politics, about power accumulation and the state's interests than promoting Shiism or much more, much less. It's much less ideologically driven. A shift has been made by leadership of Iran about a decade after the revolution. The end of war with Iraq coincided with the death of the founder of the Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini. It also heralded a new era in Iran's foreign policy. The era of revolution, at least at the international level, was over for the Iranian leadership in 1990. This resembled itself, for example, in their position during the first Gulf War, where they neither supported Saddam nor joined a coalition against their previous enemy, who had been fighting with for 8 years. It's true to say that since 1990, Iran has employed, as I mentioned, a coherent or semi-coherent, realist and instrumentalist approach to its regional and international politics. The Iranian elites have got rid of the earlier revolutionary behavior, sometimes erratic, and became more pragmatic. The later US wars with Afghanistan and Iraq and how the US has been bogged down in the region also further consolidated their position in the realistic approach to their regional and international positioning. The country's policy since then is to exploit whatever resources to balance its power at first region, hopefully for them, internationally then. And of course, regional and international players, for obvious reasons, have constantly tried to undermine Iran's role, sometimes to discount it, and in some cases champion for the regime change as we all know. But so far, their attempt resulted to an even more tumultuous Middle East. Iran has shown that it would rather play the long game, and it's shown itself as rather not so opportunistic in a sense, in contrast to a couple of its regional rivals or other players in the Middle East. All in all, what I'm trying to achieve by presenting this slide, acknowledging these two phases in trajectory of the Islamic Republic's foreign policy is instrumental in deciphering and understanding what's been going on between Iran and the rest of the world since the revolution. This long-term policy is all about expanding and consolidating its strategic depth. So the case of Iran in Syria, for example, I mean, something just popped up in my mind that they went there, they basically lobbied to bring Russia there. And then for a while, Russia was getting upper hand. Iran's engagement in Syria is becoming quite costly for the country up until, but they managed to stay. As I said, it was a costly stay until, you know, a war between Russia and Ukraine started. So Russia had to pull back. And nowadays, I mean, these days we are hearing that Iran is further consolidating its footstep in Syria, while Russia is retreating from the country. So to this end, revisiting a quote from Ayatollah Khamenei, as you could see here, could refresh our minds. Addressing the Revolutionary Guard Basij forces back in 2015, he mentioned that we have supporters, we have strategic depth, both across the region and in this country, meaning Iran. Some support us because of Islam, others because of the language, and others because of Shi'i Islam. They all constitute the country's strategic depth. And this is, I think, the common understanding in the leadership and the leadership of Iran. And they've invested in that for at least last 33 years. Building on this quote from the Supreme Leader and what I've said up to now, I'm going to wrap up my talk by reiterating some points. I'm happy to address all of these in more details in our Q&A session. I would argue that until the day external powers don't acknowledge the fact that any sustainable change towards freedom and liberation in, across the region, and for what is worse, not only Iran, other countries, should be formed organically and from the within, we are going to be dealing with chaotic Middle East. At regional level, stable and prosperous Middle East. I will, my report is more detailed in this section, but generally, for the sake of this talk, what I'm trying to say is that any stable and prosperous Middle East requires a form of détente between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Middle East won't see light of happiness should leaders of Tehran and Riyadh not be engaged in an effective dialogue. Tehran and Riyadh, I think by now they know, cannot ignore each other and are unable to outcast one another. For better or worse, in the current situation, the West is also in need of both of them. We are all prisoners of geography, so to speak. Indeed, Iran and Saudi Arabia rapprochement has a very successful precedence in the recent history. When from 1997 up until 2005, both countries had posed a enmity and strove to come up with a more comprehensive regional resolution. So in 1997, when the reformist president Khatami swept to a stunning election victory, then the Saudi crown prince Amir Abdullah made an official visit to Tehran, and dialogue started from them, which led to this, the mutual security accord in April 2001, which never was implemented due to the dismay of many in the region and the world. Such a solution is required more than ever if one aspires a relatively less tumultuous region. We cannot expect a more stable Iraq or Syria, more prosperous Lebanon, a peaceful Yemen, unless Iran and Saudi Arabia seriously engage and expedite their reconciliatory talks, which is going on in the last couple of months in Baghdad. Today, Middle East is in absolute chaos, as always, for a recent couple of decades. Socio-economic conflict, soaring prices, food shortages, environmental crisis, so on and so forth, demands further attention from all parties involved. Considering both Saudi and Iran's candidacy to reshape the balance of power in the region, leave only one option to the United States and the Europe, and that is to push for that scenario, that rapprochement between these two countries, while decreasing their direct intervention in the region. And for that, many has argued about basically or come up with this term of post-West Middle East. And for the Western great powers to work towards not only leaving the region, but also gradually building nation states or helping those states to organically flourish across the region, with Saudi Arabia and Iran on board. Otherwise, we have to expect a much deadlier region, troubles of which, as we've witnessed in the last couple of years, are going to impact not only the Middle East, but well beyond the countries. That's my last slide, and I chose these two photos to draw a conclusion. We in the discipline of IR are not necessarily in the business of prediction. So I don't really know how events will unfold in Vienna when Iran is negotiating with P4+1. I cannot predict when and how Iran is going to retaliate the assassination of one of its high-ranking colonel, which happened a couple of days ago. Not sure how the current administration is going to address domestic socio-economic troubles, partly emanating from mismanagement, greatly, many would argue, from the US sanctions imposed against Iran. I like to basically use these two photos to draw my final conclusion. A fact among all these uncertainties. 40-odd years after the revolution, in all its major regional and international dealings, Iran still finds a reliable partner in Oman, a foundation of which, a partnership, a foundation of which was laid well before the revolution by deposed Shah. So I argue, and that's my last point for today talk, that no matter who rules in Iran, irrespective of the cost, what the Islamic Republic has managed to achieve in terms of its standing in the Fertile Crescent, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, is going to be there for very, very long time. And I'd like to close my talk, maybe 2 minutes over time, by that sentence, and I'm happy to answer your question.
Wonderful, Mohammad. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
An applause to you, a virtual one. So thank you very much for this. And well, I just once more, I would like to say also to our audience, thank you for having joined us. Thank you for being with us. And the questions you might have, please put them in the chat box that is labeled Q&A at the bottom of your screen for Zoom. And of course, the audience on YouTube also, please don't hesitate to pose your questions. So fabulous. With this, let's start. Mohammad, what do you think?
Yes.
Let's dive into the questions. Let's try to group them, if you don't mind, and then we go through. I will start with a block of questions here, and I will read them so that also the audience on YouTube is aware of the question that is being posed, even though you might be able to see them in the box.
Yeah.
So the first block is, so you're thanked for this valuable talk. And so the participant says that first, you have mentioned at the beginning that among the reasons for the Iranian Revolution in '79 to occur is that there was a relaxation given to the Iranian people by the Shah based on Carter's advice. And do you think that if that relaxation had not been pressured by the US, and if it had been coming more from the Shah, would the revolution then maybe not have happened? So
Okay.
rather, if it hadn't come from the outside,
okay.
Right? So it says exactly that is external pressures cause domestic unrest, unlike when the change comes from within the system. And the second question is, the sectarian conflict between Iran and Saudi, is it only based on sectarian difference, or is it more about resource domination? For example, the conflict around oil.
Okay.
And then maybe I throw in a third one. If I may.
Yes. Yeah, go on.
And then we have another question that is, given that the United States needs to move Iran away from Russia, do you believe the future, well, this is looking into the crystal ball, the future relationship between the US and Iran will be more normalized with a serious reduction of sanctions? So I think these to start with. Thank you very much for these questions.
Thank you very much for these questions. Indeed. First, the first question was about the Iranian, the Carter pressure and the Shah and the relaxation, the political relaxation. I think I have to clarify myself that I pointed out to those two explanations, and then I ended up saying that none of these could basically single-handedly answer the question why the revolution happened. So obviously we don't know if it had come from the Shah himself, and I assume that none of the Iranians knew at the time that President Carter pressured Shah of Iran. But all in all, what I'm trying to argue here is many would point out that period of relaxation, which happened a couple of months before the revolution, as one of the explanation for the revolution. The regime of Shah at the time wasn't. Historical evidences show that we're incapable of becoming more relaxed, which perhaps could give us, or many policymakers, or those at high levels, to use and learn their lesson from the history. I would argue. So that's to answer directly. That's not. I didn't say that revolution happened because of that. I did say that it's just an explanation about why the revolution happened. Second is about the sectarian conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I think, Olivia, you joined me in promoting Sepat here as well. I mean, we argue about this a lot, and there are many detailed writing and debate going on. But to just briefly answer this question, is the sectarianism, the idea of sectarianism in the Middle East has different viewpoints. One camp, so I just come up with two camps and the one in between. One camp relates that to sort of primordial basically beliefs, that they say that they were fighting each other since day one, Shi'is and Sunnis. The other camp of scholars are basically arguing for the sort of instrumentalized sectarianism. And they would argue that how different countries, or basically states, use this or play this sectarian card, in a sense, instrumentalize these sectarian differences in order to enhance their political and power accumulation across the region, in this region, which is Middle East. And we have many other positions in between of these two camps. So I personally might place myself in between of these camps. So there are some historical, primordial conflict of belief there, but mostly I'm tilting towards this political instrumentalization of sectarian differences across the Middle East, which obviously could be, so long as we are talking about the state's interest or accumulation of power, obviously we could talk about resource domination within that framework. I hope I answered that question, but Danny Postel and Nader Hashemi's book, The Sectarianization, could be quite, especially the introductory chapter could be quite great resource for anyone who is interested in understanding these different typologies. The third question was about serious reduction of sanctions. Yeah,
exactly, and whether that could positively influence the relationship between Iran and the US, whether it would lead to normalization, more normalization.
So this is I think multifaceted question. I have issue with some part of the question. I'm not quite sure if US want to move away Iran from Russia, or even if it's possible, because these two countries, two states, as we know, and it is always, I always start whenever it comes to these questions, with picturing the geography in my mind, because that could be quite revealing. Iran and Russia are our neighbors. So nobody, I think, neither Russia nor Iran nor even United States could move them away. They are trapped in a sense in this geography, for better or worse. So that's an issue which I had with the question. But when it comes to sanctions, U.S. sanctions against Iran, as we know, we had this deal in place which is active. Iran was abiding by the terms of the deal, which was signed in 2015 and implemented in 2016, up until President Trump of the United States basically torn down the deal and imposed these new sanctions. So part of those sanctions are based on international law or illegal sanctions, but obviously we are not talking law here or legal issues here. I'm not an expert, and perhaps we are not living realistically in a law-abiding international community anyway. But I believe for JCPOA or for any to reinstate it, or for any any sense of reconciliation between Iran and the US and the broader West, we definitely need to, or at least policymakers in the US need to come up with some solution regarding lifting sanctions. Because at the end of the day, I am the proponent of this idea that even JCPOA, perhaps more than it being a legal document, although it's a legal document, and I think I believe it's a deficiency of that agreement. It happened because of Iran's economic demands, and so long as it doesn't have any economic benefit to Iran, it remains shaky. And it's not only applicable to JCPOA, for any other, hopefully future, agreement between Iran and other countries, and more specifically the West, European countries and United States. I think first and foremost, as President Clinton, I think, once mentioned in totally irrelevant conversation to ours, is about economy is stupid. So if there is no economic benefit for Iran, perhaps dealing with Iran or expecting Iran to show any leniency, let alone to move away from Russia, is just impossible.
Thank you, Mohammad. I just wanted to say as well, we have further participants thanking you for the lecture and telling you that you have given them much food for thought. I also Mohammad, could you mention just the title of the paper that you mentioned in your lecture as well, so that if people would like to go back to it, that they know the title?
The paper
in media communication.
Yeah, it's Iran, Iraq. I am searching for it myself.
You're Googling yourself.
It's embarrassing. The media context during the Iran-Iraq war. It's published 2020 by at Media War and Conflict. I could perhaps put a link in a chat box. Okay. I don't know if.
Great. So if anybody would like to take a look at that, I mean, apart from what you mentioned regarding the research that Sapad is doing, of course, you can also refer to that. Then, if you agree, then I'll continue with questions.
Yeah, so, sure.
Let's hook on, because we have just been speaking about the JCPOA, and this is a great opportunity to pose that question and also to steer it back to another topic, to connect it to Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
We have one participant that is wondering about the role that Saudi Arabia has played in the negotiations around the JCPOA.
Okay. I think we should distinguish between JCPOA and Iran-West talk. Okay. Because when we are talking about JCPOA, we are talking about a specific piece of document or agreement which happened, as I said, in 2015. For better or worse, Saudi Arabia or any other regional country wasn't part of that negotiation. So basically, talking about joining to that negotiation when these days, I don't think they are in Vienna at the moment, but it's still there. When they are talking about or negotiating about how US could come back to the JCPOA, I think it's just irrelevant of talking about how joining, other states into that, agreement. If we could go back to the history, go back into the history back in 2014, 13. I would perhaps encourage all the participants to include Saudi Arabia or other regional. Perhaps for practical reason, they definitely considered that, but for practical reason that wasn't possible. Having said that, I am all for, as my talk showed, all for regional dialogue for the sake of the region. So JCPOA, I know it's about putting, control on Iran's nuclear, which ultimately and inevitably deals with Iran's regional neighbors as well. But I don't think for its, within the current framework of nuclear talk, we can discuss of involving Saudi Arabia. But I certainly think that, for example, these parallel talks between the new administration, relatively new administration in Iran, and Saudi Arabia and Baghdad could be a facilitator for JCPOA basically becoming resumed. So in that sense, if we are specifically talking about Saudi Arabia and its role in JCPOA today, I think it is an irrelevant question. But if you are talking about Iran, Saudi Arabia, perhaps other regional countries coming up and engaging in dialogue towards the regional issues and affairs, yes, of course, we need to have that. And I think both states has come to this understanding that it's inevitable for them to consider to basically sit down and come up with some sort of solution.
Yes. Mohammad, we also have a question that will move a little bit into the transnational.
Okay.
So first, the participant thanks you for the presentation. And so the question is, what do you think about the relations between Iran and Hezbollah after the elections in Lebanon? And I also would like to add to that a question, hooking on to what you have told us. I would like to know, how has, let's say, the attractiveness evolved of Iran's ideology? Has it lost its charm because of also what you have told us earlier? Mm-hmm. How important is it still? Is it still a good connector, so to say, or has it become more of an obstacle?
Quite interesting questions. I'm not quite sure if I have an answer to them. I only try to basically share with you what I am thinking at the moment, and I'm emphasizing at the moment because every person evolves in its thinking and its positioning. But at the moment, Iran Hezbollah connection, I think, is one of the most robust connection between two political parties in the Middle East. It's shaped and formed organically through decades. So I don't think it's gonna crack anytime soon. So if they ask me a question about what is the most profitable investment, politically speaking, by and the state, definitely Iran's investment on Hezbollah comes at top of my list, or one of the top items, especially when you talk about balance of power in the region, Israel's nuclear warhead, all those stuff go into detail. But for the sake of argument, for the sake of time, accept from me that that was a good investment, and I don't think it's gonna change after the election, this election, or next election, or the one which comes. I mean, this could be harmful, or has been back to your question about attractiveness. I mean, it appears that there are many other factors involved here, and it's becoming. They are becoming more important, so to speak. Socioeconomic factor. We are dealing, or these countries are dealing with trends of youth population, who are not necessarily ideological, or some of them might not even practicing. So in that paper about Iran-Iraq war, I argue that how the messaging should be reformulated, messaging coming from Iran at least, or how they could become attractive. But I think one of the main issues which Iran, I could argue that otherwise, that Iran is still important in these countries, irrespective of economic problems that it's facing, irrespective of all these external and internal pressure. Just because the ideology, the Shi'i ideology, at least in Iraq and Lebanon, is so powerful to basically tolerate all these threats and external pressures. So powerful in a sense that it's quite dynamic, so it could shape and reshape itself in different forms to basically help help Iran's interest in those countries for the time being. Imagine or suppose that Iran could again at some point reinforce its position financially, then I think many of these lost attractiveness would come back again.
Very interesting that you said that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because after all, things are in flux, right? And we see ever changing sets of ideas, evolving, coming back, disappearing, reappearing. But however, leaving that thought a little bit, maybe we come back to it once more. But one of the participants also mentioned that the role of Western and the participant says here great or imperial powers was mostly absent in your presentation. And maybe to bring it in, you mentioned at the very beginning that actually there was a misperception from the outside of what was happening, or what was going to happen, and how things would be at the time of the revolution, or when the end of the monarchy and the inception of the Islamic Republic. And as you were speaking, I have been thinking that actually this misperception has characterized the relations between Iran and now let's pick up on that term here. The participant used the Western great powers. Can we actually take it from there that ever since there has been this change and misperception has been a great term to characterize the relations.
Yeah. I mean, certainly. I mean,
and also among, to the extent also to policymakers, also, how Iran is viewed not only by politicians, but also if we extend it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, there are many factors here which add on to that, mistrust, let's say, between both parties. But I would argue, for example, the hostage crisis in Iran, when Iranian revolutionaries stormed to U.S. embassy in Tehran and captured hostage. I think a couple of them remained in custody in Iran for more than a year, 444 days, something like that. And that shaped the policies of United States or Washington for decades to come. So even today, you could see in New York Times reporting or Wall Street Journal, U.S. media, that they are referring to that incident whenever they want to, or the author wants to demonize Iranian leadership, or they argue why U.S. shouldn't rejoin JCPOA, but referring to that historical event, which I have to come back a little bit to the question. I didn't discount the role of, or the destructive role of Western. In fact, the very term of post-West Middle East was just to mention that any peaceful or relatively stable Middle East is not going to happen unless we are thinking about the post-West Middle East. And realities on the ground promising that post-West Middle East, because remaining in the Middle East in a way that these Western great powers is practiced for a long time for now has become quite costly, and they cannot afford it. I mean, to be honest. But back to this misperception that has blurred the decision making of policymakers, not only in Washington but also in Tehran as well. There are numerous incidents or anecdotes which we could bring up to accuse each party to not seizing an opportunity. Many would argue that Taliban of 2001 couldn't be toppled down without the help of General Soleimani and its forces and its alliance with the Northern Alliance against Taliban helping United States. But later on, a couple of months later, President Bush came out saying Iran is the part of this axis of evil. Some would argue that Iran's leadership missed the opportunity during Obama administration when they were talking. I mean, there are hundreds of these cases in the relationship between Iran and the US and Iran and the West. And I for one, cannot basically cite which one is basically has the right. There are some realities on the ground which indicate, at least many had argued about JCPOA. You could find that when we are talking about JCPOA, that as a tangible point, that both parties, P5+1 and Iran, reached to an agreement, and Iran for so long was abiding, and then all of a sudden, a US president comes out, tore up the agreement, and that doesn't help. That's all I'm saying. And for any kind of logical observer of the recent events, I think it's quite easy or straightforward to find out, at least based on that specific incident, who was abiding the international norm, and what was the party which basically went rogue. But yeah, the role of Western great powers is, I think, well documented across the Middle East for centuries now, and but I think the future in that sense could be quite positive for Middle Eastern and citizens of the region.
Great, thank you, Mohammad. And shall we maybe wrap it up just by one? I ask you for your 2 cents on one last question, and which is just coming back a little bit to what you said, and to maybe reiterate once more. So, what is it? Talking about ideology and Iran's strategic depth. Is Iran foreign policy driven then? Connecting, of course, to this unresolved debate, is it driven by pragmatism or by ideology?
If I'm talking, if you're asking for my 2 cents, I would basically tilt it towards pragmatism. But again, I didn't want to self-promote myself, but for the risk of self-promotion, in the book, the Kalantari and the Modern Middle East, I discuss how Shi'i ideology could be, is perhaps one of the most suitable, let's say, resource for any pragmatic player. So this is why sometimes observer or external observer was kind of confused between ideology and pragmatism. Mm-hmm. All I'm saying is Iran or Iranian leadership know how to play. They are pragmatic, and they know how to play Shi'ism towards that end when it comes to instrumentalizing and using that their realpolitik towards their realpolitik interest.
Wonderful. I think this is a wonderful closure to the session.
Fantastic.
And with this, then, once again, thank you very much to the audience here with us on Zoom and also on YouTube. Thank you once more to the IEMed, and thank you to you, Mohammad, for being with us for this very interesting lecture. And I hope that this will also be an inspiration for our audience to engage further with Iran, with your work. And I hope we have been able to answer your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Olivia. Thank you, IEMed, and thank you to all, thank you all participants, and wish you all the best. Good evening.